Moscow is burning, not metaphorically, literally. At 2:17 in the morning on May 17th, the sky above the Russian capital filled with the sound that Moscow was never supposed to hear at scale. Engines, small ones, hundreds of them. By dawn, the Russian Ministry of Defense was forced to admit that 556 Ukrainian drones had been intercepted or shot down across more than a dozen regions of the Russian Federation in a single night. The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya, the facility that fuels the capital itself, was burning. The Solnechny-Gorsk oil loading station in Durychino was burning. The MKB Raduga cruise missile plant in Dubna was burning. The Elma Technology Park in Zelenograd, the JSC Angstrom semiconductor facility, residential blocks in Khimki, Mytishchi, Lobnya, Narofominsk, Zelenograd, all of them in a single coordinated night became part of one strategic message delivered by a country that the Kremlin once claimed would be conquered in 72 hours. This is not a story about a drone attack. This is not a story about broken windows in the Moscow suburbs or about an oil refinery shutting down for what Reuters sources describe as several days of repair. What you are witnessing is the operational moment when the strategic depth of the Russian Federation, the very concept of a protected rear area that has defined Russian military doctrine since the Second World War, collapsed in front of the cameras of its own citizens. This is a case study in a larger pattern. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened on May 17th, but why it was always going to happen, why Moscow's air defense architecture was built to lose this exact engagement, and why what comes next is not a recovery, it is an acceleration. Pull the lens back. To understand the gravity of what happened on May 17th, you have to understand what Moscow believed about itself before that night. For 3 decades, the Russian General Staff designed its homeland defense around a single inherited assumption that war, if it ever came, would come over the horizon as identifiable manned aircraft and ballistic systems flown by an organized state adversary at known azimuths. The S-400, the Pantsir, the layered Moscow Air Defense District, the famous concrete rings around the capital. Every element of that architecture was optimized to detect, classify, and engage large, fast, expensive, radar-visible threats. It was a doctrine for fighting NATO over the North European plain. It was never, at any point in its design history, a doctrine for fighting 200 to 600 slow, low, cheap, plywood and foam autonomous aircraft launched in coordinated waves from 400 to 1,200 kilometers away by a country Russian planners had categorized as a tactical problem, not a strategic one. That was the first mistake. And it was not a tactical mistake. It was psychological. Russia did not just underestimate Ukrainian drone production. Russia underestimated the entire category of warfare that Ukraine was about to invent in real time at industrial scale. In February 2022, the Russian invasion plan assumed Ukraine had no meaningful deep strike capability and never would. In the autumn of 2022, when the first improvised long-range drones began crossing the border, Russian commentators dismissed them as propaganda toys. In 2023, when Ukrainian drones reached the outskirts of Moscow for the first time, the Kremlin framed it as a stunt. In 2024, Ukraine launched over 1,000 drones at Russian military targets across the year. In July 2025, that figure crossed 3,000 in a single month. By March of this year, according to figures compiled by United 24 and corroborated by Western tracking analysts, Ukraine launched approximately 7,000 long-range strike drones against Russian territory in a single 30-day window. Let that sink in for a moment. In less than 3 years, Ukraine moved from being categorized by the Russian General Staff as incapable of deep strike to being the global leader in deep strike. There is no historical precedent for that adaptation curve. None. Not in the Second World War, not in Vietnam, not in the Gulf. This is the fastest expansion of a deep strike capability ever achieved by a defending state in the modern era. And it gets even more serious from here, because what happened on May 17th was not just a quantity event. It was a quality event. The 556 interceptions claimed by the Russian Defense Ministry tell you something important, but they do not tell you the most important thing. The most important thing is what the Ukrainian Defense Ministry confirmed the following morning. The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya, the Solnechny-Gorsk oil loading facility, and several specific microelectronics production sites were struck for the first time. Read that sentence again. For the first time. These were not targets that had been bombed before and bombed again. These were facilities that, in the official assessment of the Ukrainian command, had previously been protected by Russian air defense well enough to be considered out of reach. On the night of May 17th, that protection failed, and it did not fail at the periphery. It failed in the southeastern industrial belt of the Russian capital itself, roughly 17 kilometers from the Kremlin walls. This is the moment a doctrine breaks. The real question is not how many drones got through. The real question is what the geometry of those penetrations tells you about the structural condition of the Russian air defense network in May 2026. And the answer, when you sit with the operational data, is uncomfortable for Moscow in a way it has not previously been uncomfortable. The Russian air defense system around the capital is not collapsing because it is incompetent. It is collapsing because it is mathematically overwhelmed. A Panzer launcher carries a finite number of interceptors. An S-400 battery has a finite engagement rate. Each interceptor missile costs between several $100,000 and several $1 million. Each Ukrainian strike drone costs, depending on the model, between $5,000 and $50,000. When you fire a $2 million missile at a $15,000 drone and you still miss, you have not just lost a tactical engagement, you have lost a war of industrial economics. And when you scale that mismatch across 556 engagements in one night, what you have created is not air defense. What you have created is a slow-motion bankruptcy of the entire Russian homeland defense posture. Now let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because the headlines are about Moscow, but the deeper story is about Kapotnya, about Ryazan, about the systemic targeting of refining capacity that has accelerated since January. The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya processes approximately 12 million tons of crude per year. It is one of the principal sources of motor fuel for the entire Moscow metropolitan area. On May 17th, that refinery was hit. According to Reuters reporting confirmed by sources inside the industry, the damage was characterized as minor, but operations were halted for what was officially described as security reasons and unofficially expected to take several days to restore. 2 days before that, on May 15th, the Ryazan refinery, one of the 5 largest in Russia, had already been struck and set ablaze, killing 4 people on the ground and forcing another extended shutdown. That is not a coincidence. That is a campaign. This is not a story about drones. This is a story about the Russian fuel supply. Ukraine has identified, with surgical clarity, that the single most exposed strategic vulnerability of the Russian war machine in 2026 is not its army, not its air force, not its navy. It is its refining throughput. Russia has enormous crude reserves. Russia has plentiful production, but refined product, diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel, the actual liquid that moves armies and economies, is produced at a relatively small number of large, fixed, vulnerable facilities, most of them constructed in the Soviet era, most of them designed without serious aerial threat in mind, and most of them concentrated in European Russia where Ukrainian drones can now physically reach. By striking refineries in succession, Ukraine is doing to the Russian energy system in 2026 what the 8th Air Force did to the German synthetic fuel industry in 1944. And the doctrinal lesson is identical. You do not have to defeat an army in the field if you can starve its logistics of motion. The mainstream framing of May 17th misses this entirely. Most of the Western press coverage focused on the human story, the residential damage in Khimki, the Indian citizen killed in the strikes, the 4 total fatalities reported across the Moscow region. That coverage is accurate and that loss of life matters, but it is not the strategic story. The strategic story is what Ukraine demonstrated about its targeting architecture. 556 tracked aerial threats, multiple confirmed penetrations of an air defense ring that the Kremlin has spent 20 years and tens of billions of dollars constructing, simultaneous engagement of energy infrastructure, microelectronics infrastructure, and missile production infrastructure in a single coordinated wave, and a public Ukrainian declaration the next morning that this was, in Zelensky's words, an entirely justified response. That is not a raid. That is a strike campaign demonstrating that the Ukrainian General Staff can now select Russian strategic targets, layer false axis decoy approaches, exhaust local air defense magazines, and land terminal effects on facilities that were previously considered too well protected to hit. That is the actual headline, and almost no mainstream outlet reported it that way. Here's the hidden military variable that explains everything else. Ukrainian deep strike in 2026 is not being conducted by a single weapon system. It is being conducted by a layered family of platforms. The slow, long-range Lyuti-class one-way attack drones for distance and saturation. The faster jet-powered platforms for time-sensitive targets. The reconnaissance drones for terminal guidance. The decoys, the Paradia-class systems, designed to look real on radar, draw interceptor fire, exhaust missile reloads, and create corridors through which the strike package transits. When Russia reports 556 drones intercepted, what Russia is actually reporting is that its air defense engaged 556 radar tracks. We do not know, and Russia has every incentive not to disclose, how many of those tracks were decoys whose specific tactical purpose was to be intercepted so that the real strike vehicles could penetrate. That is the operational logic of a mature deep strike doctrine, and it is precisely the logic the Russian air defense network was never built to fight. Pull the lens back again, because this is where the analysis must escalate. What happened on May 17th is consistent with a broader pattern that has been visible since the start of this year. In January, Ukrainian strikes hit refineries in Volgograd and Saratov. In February and March, the campaign expanded to the Ryazan, Tuapse, Novokubishevsk, and Nizhny Novgorod facilities. By April, according to industry analysts tracking Russian refining throughput, approximately 15 to 17% of total Russian primary refining capacity was offline at any given moment due to drone damage and repair cycles. Gasoline prices in Russian regional markets began climbing through the spring. Fuel rationing reappeared in Crimea and in the southern Russian regions. Diesel exports were quietly restricted. And then came May. And in May, two of Russia's most strategically important refineries, Ryazan on the 15th, Moscow on the 17th, were hit within 48 hours of each other. This matters enormously, because it tells you that the Ukrainian campaign is not opportunistic, it is sequenced. It is sequenced to compound. Each strike multiplies the repair backlog, multiplies the load on undamaged facilities, multiplies the price pressure, multiplies the strain on Russian state revenue, and multiplies the political cost of denying any of it. What you are witnessing is not random damage. It is the systemic dismantling of the Russian war economy's energy backbone, and it is being conducted by a country that, in 2022, was assessed by Russian planners as too small, too poor, too dependent, and too demoralized to last a month. The broader lesson here is one that the Russian General Staff did not want to learn and now cannot avoid. Strategic depth in the 21st century is no longer a function of geography. It is a function of detection and interception economics. If your enemy can produce 100,000 strike drones a year at $15,000 each, then a 1,000-kilometer buffer means nothing. The map looks the same. The doctrine is dead. And it gets even more serious from here, because the climactic operational moment of this campaign is not actually the strikes you have already seen. It is the strikes that are about to come, and the structural fact that Russia has now lost the ability to prevent them. Consider what happened on the night of May 17th in geographic terms. Ukrainian drones did not just reach the Moscow Oblast periphery. They reached Khimki, which is functionally a suburb of the capital. They reached Zelenograd, which is inside the federal city limits. They reached Mytishchi. They reached the MKB Raduga Design Bureau in Dubna, which is the facility that produces the KH-55 and KH-101 cruise missiles that Russia has been firing at Ukrainian cities for 3.5 years. Read that one more time. Ukraine struck the factory that produces the missiles that Russia uses to strike Ukraine. The operational symmetry is absolute. The doctrinal verdict is unambiguous. The Russian missile campaign against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure no longer has a sanctuary at the source. This is the moment a war changes shape. For 38 months, Russian strategy has been built on the assumption that the cost of war could be inflicted on Ukraine while the cost would not be inflicted on Russia. That asymmetry was the entire premise. It is gone. It is gone in Belgorod. It is gone in Kursk. It is gone in Bryansk. It is gone in Rostov. It is gone in Voronezh. It is gone in Ryazan. And after the night of May 17th, it is gone in Moscow. The Russian population that spent 3 years watching the war on television is now watching apartment buildings in Khimki being patched by construction workers while neighbors discuss, according to reporting in the New York Times, a new category of household insurance, insurance against drones. There is no spin operation in the Kremlin that can undo that image. There is no information ministry that can put that genie back in the bottle. The war has arrived at the windows of the Russian middle class, and it arrived there because Russian strategy created the conditions for its own arrival. What seemed safe became catastrophe once a single decision was made, the decision in Kiev 18 months ago to commit fully to deep strike as the central strategic effort of the Ukrainian war machine. That decision is paying off now in compounding waves, and the Russian response to it has been doctrinally the worst possible response. Rather than restructuring its air defense around layered low-altitude detection, rather than accepting the cost of redesigning its homeland defense posture, the Russian military has chosen to absorb the strikes, hide the damage, suppress the reporting, and continue its grinding ground offensive in the Donbass as if nothing has changed. That is not strategy. That is denial. And denial in war is the most expensive luxury a state can purchase. History will record May 17, 2026, as one of the inflection points of this war. Not because the damage was catastrophic. The Moscow refinery will restart in a matter of days. The Dubna missile plant will repair its damage. The Russian state will continue to function. But because of what was proven. What was proven on that night is that the Russian Federation no longer possesses meaningful strategic depth against the country it invaded. What was proven is that the cost of Russian aggression can now be delivered to the addresses of Russian war production with operational reliability. What was proven is that the asymmetric premise of Putin's war is finished. And here is the larger pattern this confirms. Every 6 months of this war, the operational ceiling of Ukrainian capability has risen by an order of magnitude, while the structural ceiling of Russian adaptation has stayed roughly flat. In 2022, Ukraine could reach 20 kilometers behind the front. In 2023, 200. In 2024, 600. In 2025, 1,500. In 2026, Ukrainian platforms have demonstrated reach against Engels, against Olenia, against the Caspian Basin facilities, against the entire western refining belt of the Russian Federation. That is not a linear escalation. That is a geometric one. Russia, by contrast, is still fighting the same war it started. Massed artillery, infantry assaults in small groups on motorcycles, Shahed waves at Ukrainian cities, and political pressure for negotiations on its terms. One side is learning, the other side is repeating. And in war, the side that learns faster wins, no matter how much steel and manpower the other side throws into the meat grinder. The verdict is this: May 17th was not a one-night spectacle. May 17th was the public arrival of a campaign that has been building for 2 years. It is a campaign that targets the actual nervous system of the Russian war economy, its refining capacity, its missile production, its semiconductor industry, its political confidence. And it is a campaign that Russia, at this stage in the war, no longer has the doctrinal flexibility, the air defense magazine depth, or the industrial reserve to defeat. The strategic forecast from here is straightforward. The Ukrainian deep strike campaign will accelerate, not slow. The targets will move closer to the heart of Russian state power, not farther from it. The refineries that are still online today will not all be online in 90 days. The political pressure inside Russia, currently suppressed by censorship and inertia, will begin to surface as fuel prices climb and damage reports leak around the official narrative. And the question that the Russian General Staff will be unable to answer, the question that haunts every cornered military bureaucracy in history, is the question of whether you can continue a war of conquest abroad when the war of consequence has arrived at home. That question does not have a simple answer, and the people who tell you it does are not paying attention. What I can tell you from decades of watching how armies move and how empires miscalculate is that wars are not lost in capitals. Wars are lost in the moment when a capital realizes it is no longer untouchable. Moscow had that moment on May 17th. The smoke over Kapotnya was the proof. The empty windows in Khimki were the proof. The shuttered refinery gates were the proof. And the silence from the Kremlin in the hours after the strikes was the loudest proof of all. Stay with this channel, because the next phase of this campaign is already being prepared, and the next strike package is already being built. If you want to understand the war at the strategic level, not the level of the daily headlines, but the level of the doctrines that decide which side wins, subscribe to Ben Hodges Updates. Help us reach the next milestone on this channel so we can keep delivering this analysis to the audience that needs it. The story of May 17th is not finished. The story of what happens to a nuclear-armed state when its strategic depth collapses has barely begun. And when the next milestone in this campaign arrives, and it is coming sooner than Moscow believes, I will walk you through exactly what it means, exactly why it was inevitable, and exactly what it tells you about the war that is no longer the war Russia thought it was fighting. History is being written in real time. Make sure you are reading it from the people who can actually see the page.